Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glad we had this meeting here in the committee room in person. I'd also like to thank all of our witnesses who are here with us today. Look forward to hearing their testimony. A hearing on this topic is long overdue. For more than 2 years, we've heard about the damage the U.S. COVID policies have done to our nation's children, as well as working parents. Parents pleaded with their local school boards to inject actual science and common sense in these rules. Congressional Republicans have sent letters, asked for hearings and briefings, and begged the CDC to explain the science that justified the harm that their ridiculous policies were causing to our kids. Here's what we know. Remote learning hurt children, both academically and emotionally. And scheduling disruptions at school and daycare centers created chaos for working families, hindering them from returning to the workforce at a time when we need more workers. It is clearly one of the largest U.S. failures in policy that we've seen during this pandemic. Many Democrat-led states and teachers' union bosses refused to reopen schools for more than a year in some places, despite evidence that closures and instability harm America's children. In the summer of 2020, Republicans repeatedly called on governors and school systems to fully reopen schools. Student learning loss due to remote or hybrid learning is astronomical. Millions of kids are behind in math and reading. Amplify, which is the curriculum and assessment provider, examined its test data for about 400,000 elementary school students and found that, quote, at the middle of the 2021-22 school year, in every elementary grade, K through 5, the number of students at risk of not reading is higher than it was at the same point in the 2019-20 school year, close quote. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit 4 different studies into the record that have been done to detail the data and the detrimental impact that remote learning has had on America's children. Thank you. On top of learning loss, children and teenagers are now experiencing a mental health crisis of historic proportions. The American Academy of Pediatrics declared a national state of emergency in children's mental health, and the U.S. Surgeon General issued a youth mental health advisory. Suicide attempts by 12 to 17-year-old girls rose 51% from early 2019 to early 2021. This is having a devastating impact on our young kids. When kids have been able to go back to school or to daycare, the CDC has pushed extreme quarantine policies, especially for kids that can't wear masks. This means that if one kid in a class gets COVID, the whole class is shut down for up to 10 days. Can you imagine the negative impact this is having, not only on students, but also on their parents? Abrupt closures and long quarantines mean they miss work unexpectedly, for many days at a time. These disruptions are caused by irrational COVID policies, and they continue to this day in many cases. According to a survey by the New York Times, in January, more than half of American children missed at least 3 days of school. About 25% missed more than a week, while 14% of students missed 9 or more days. This keeps parents from returning to the workforce, and data shows that especially has had a negative impact on women. On top of that, until last Friday, the CDC said that everyone over the age of 2 had to wear a mask, even though worldwide, most countries don't mask young kids in school due to the harm that it causes those kids. And the protection masks provide to children is unknown and might be very small. The CDC said kids should be masked for the last 2 years. This is something Republicans in Congress, as well as parents across the country, have been begging the CDC to change, since we have come to learn so much more about COVID and its largely minimal impact on young kids compared to the well-documented massive damage that masks and remote learning are having on young children. Over the last few weeks, we started to see mask mandates lifted in most major cities, including New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., as well as Los Angeles, in restaurants and other public spaces. Yet, unbelievably, the mask mandates for children in schools and daycare centers remained. Their plan was to force kids to mask all day in school or at daycare in most cases even while they're outside. But yet adults would be allowed to be maskless in grocery stores, restaurants, bars, and of course, sporting events. I'd like to note here that this hypocrisy of some of these nonsensical political science policies have been ongoing throughout the entire pandemic. Prominent Democrats have been caught ignoring their own masking rules while forcing those same rules on children for the last 2 years. Liberal elites have been spotted without masks at hair salons, the Met Gala, professional football games, fancy restaurants, and many, many more, while those same hypocritical leaders shamed others who didn't comply with their nonsensical mandates. But as we know now, we have had this COVID miracle in the last few days. Just in time for President Biden's State of the Union address last night, we saw, just days ago, Biden's Centers for Disease Control and Prevention finally update its mask guidelines. The new guidelines mean that instead of recommending nearly the entire country mask indoors, now only 28% are recommended to do so. So overnight, more than 70% of the country, including kids in school, don't have to mask anymore. So we should ask, Mr. Chairman, what changed? Did the science change? Again, it's not the medical science. It seemed like Democrats had an epiphany of political science. And what is that new science? Here we have excerpts from a memo by a group called Impact Research, which is a well-known Democrat polling firm that also happens to be where President Biden's pollster works. So according to Punchbowl News, note the memo, by the way, is dated February 24th, 2022, just days ago. So this is what it said, quote, this is an assessment from a poll, not from medical science. 2/3 of parents and 80% of teachers say the pandemic caused learning loss, and voters are overwhelmingly more worried about learning loss than kids getting COVID. 6 in 10 Americans describe themselves as worn out by the pandemic. The more we, and they're talking about Democrat-elected leaders right here, the more we talk about the threat of COVID and onerously restricting people's lives because of it, the more we turn them against us and show them we're out of touch with their daily realities. I wish that was medical science that they were basing decisions on, but it was a poll just days before the State of the Union that got them to change course. That's the kind of thing that is infuriating parents. So Biden's CDC is only loosening its masking requirements now that Democrats' polling numbers are in the tank and the midterms are around the corner. During the campaign, Joe Biden promised repeatedly to, quote, follow the science. But apparently the science changes when his polling changes. The American people see right through these masking political theater guidelines and will never forget how they played politics with our children by shuttering their schools and masking their faces, even as doctors were noting the harm that those mandates were causing to our children. People have lost faith in the CDC, and this brazen political stunt is further eroding what trust was left. Last night during the State of the Union, President Biden said, quote, let's stop looking at COVID-19 as a partisan dividing line. By the way, this is from the same president whose administration directed the Department of Justice to investigate parents who were passionately expressing their First Amendment speech rights in opposition to many of these same regulations by going to school board meetings. And what did President Biden's administration do? They tried to deem them as domestic terrorists for going to school board meetings and expressing their views. And that's after last night the president said, stop using COVID-19 as a partisan dividing line. Well, I think those parents wouldn't be so angry if President Biden paid them an apology for the things he said about them and allowed his administration to continue to call them names and try to shame them for standing up for the rights of their kids. So we're going to continue to push for medical science, not political science, and let's free up our children from this experiment that has destroyed millions of lives over these last 2 years. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.